When building a backend with Node.js, commonly you want to connect to a database. The easiest way to connect to a SQL database is by using an ORM. Two of the most popular ORMs for Node.js developers is Typeorm and Prisma. To help you decide which ORM to use, I built the same backend using both Prisma and Typeorm. The factors I will use in deciding the best ORM is popularity, their schema type, tooling, and basic CRUD operations. Let's begin. The first criteria is popularity, and Typeorm has the win on this one, as it has over 26.7 thousand stars on GitHub and 576,000 downloads weekly on NPM. Prisma, on the other hand, only has 19.1 thousand stars and 216,000 downloads weekly. However, both these ORMs are very popular, and Prisma's much better documentation helps make up for some less stars on GitHub. And the documentation for Prisma is amazing. Prisma's docs has lots of guides, and their reference docs are easy to search and to use in your projects. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Typeorm. Typeorm's documentation does not have a search feature, and their website feels clunky at best. However, Typeorm does have fewer issues on GitHub than Prisma does, and while this isn't the ultimate indicator of a project's health, it is worth noting. Moving on to schemas, Prisma and Typeorm are fundamentally different in this topic. In Typeorm, you have classes, and then you use TypeScript decorators to decorate those classes as entities to create tables, and then you can add your columns as fields in those classes. Prisma, on the other hand, has their own schema file. In this file is where you can model your database, and then Prisma will auto-generate the code that allows you to connect. It's worth noting that while the Prisma schema is easy to understand, it is not supported in IntelliJ, and the current plugin noted on the Prisma's documentation does not actually work on IntelliJ. To get around this, I had to use VS Code to code the schema file, and then use IntelliJ to code the rest. This isn't an issue if you use VS Code, but if you're an IntelliJ user, it is very annoying. Moving on to tooling. Typeorm has a CLI that you can use from anything from creating a new entity, to creating migrations, to running those migrations, creating subscribers, and more. I didn't have any issues while working with Typeorm's CLI. Prisma has a similar CLI that you can use to create migrations and run those as well. However, Prisma's tooling goes a little beyond that. Prisma also has Prisma Studio, which allows you to inspect your databases using a graphical interface, and it works well with the entity structure of Prisma. Also, Prisma has Data Platform, which is an early access but looks promising and is a way for you to host your database with Prisma. So while both ORMs have a similar CLIs, Prisma has a more comprehensive set of tooling surrounding it. Another important category when deciding ORMs is stability. You don't want to have to rewrite the code you've written just to match a new update. This one definitely goes to Typeorm, as it has remained basically the same for quite a while, and Prisma has changed versions from 1 all the way to 3. And Prisma 3 introduced many breaking changes. Hopefully they will not do this in the future, but it is worth noting that Prisma has introduced breaking changes before, and so they may do it again in the future, as Typeorm has not had this issue. This is especially important if you're building an enterprise application, as stability is very important as you have to maintain the software over a long period of time. Now let's look at some code for what these look like in the real world. First we have Typeorm. And for all of these, I am using a Nest.js project. To connect to your database in Typeorm, use typeormmodule.forRoot, and then you fill in all the fields you need to connect to your database. You also have to list all of your entities as well in this connection. Typeorm also has a cool feature called Synchronize. This makes it so that while you're in development, Typeorm will match your database with the entity files listed, so you don't have to run any migrations while beginning out. However, once you have your service, then you're going to want to turn Synchronize off because it is unsafe to use in production, as it can lead to unexpected database changes. Once you have a connection, you can import each entity. So for example, in your users module, I am importing the user from typeorm.module.forFeature. Then in your constructor, you can inject the repository using Typeorm. This fits great into Nest.js dependency injection. Once you have your repository, you can begin basic CRUD operations. So here in our to-do service, we have a list of to-dos, and if you want to get a specific to-do based off an ID, you can just pass in that ID into the to-do repo.findOne method. If you want to query based off anything else, you can create a object and then have where, and then you can query those fields as well. And you'll notice you're getting type safety in your query parameters. Our next example here uses pagination with Typeorm. This function is simply returning all the to-dos associated with a specific user ID. Unfortunately, Typeorm does not allow cursor-based pagination. It only allows offset, so you see we're only passing in a skip and take, but no cursor. Our next example is where we create a to-do, and so all we're basically doing is using the to-do repo.create. It creates the actual class that's a to-do, and then you have to save that class into the to-do repo, so it's a two-step process using Typeorm. And updating and deleting entities are simple as well, as seen below. Relations in Typeorm is handled in your entity files. And remember, unlike Prisma, Typeorm uses classes to scheme out the database instead of a schema file. So in our to-do class, we are referencing the user, and then we're having a many-to-one decorator on top of it. Inside of the many-to-one decorator, we're pointing to user, and then we're also pointing to the user to-dos array. Then in our user entity, we're pointing to the to-dos using a one-to-many type decorator. The Typeorm documentation does a good job of explaining relations as well. Unfortunately, I looked all through the docs, and it doesn't tell you how to get a relation. Both the ORMs clients allow you to do more advanced things as well, such as loading eager connection, cascade deletes, ordering, and more. Moving on to Prisma, instead of having classes where your entities are stored, instead you have a schema.prisma file. Here is where you will model your database. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a point of annoyance for me because IntelliJ doesn't support the .prisma file, and the current recommended plugin is not working. However, if you code in VS Code, this isn't an issue. The Prisma schema file works by first you have a generator, which is your client provider, and then you create your data source, where it's a link to your database URL, and then you can create your models. Every model has a set of fields, which are essentially the columns for that table. Prisma, like Typeorm, also allows you to set default created, updated at times, and relations as well. Then to generate the connection code, you can just run Prisma generate, which will generate the client code. So unlike Typeorm, which uses generics, Prisma will actually generate the actual types for you. Prisma CRUD is similar to Typeorm as well. For example, to get a specific element, you can say .find unique, and then you can have the where and pass in your ID field. However, one benefit of Prisma is cursor-based pagination. Another benefit of Prisma is instead of having to create your own DTO objects when you're updating or creating to-dos, Prisma has generated your own types, such as to-do create input, to-do update input, and more. If you want to look at this code more in depth, I would recommend checking out the code repo in the description below. I have a fully working REST API, which allows you to create users, create to-dos associated with those users, update the to-dos, delete the to-dos, update the users, and more. So you can look at that code if you're trying to decide based off what the code looks like of Prisma versus Typeorm. Another important part of an ORM is migrations. Both Prisma and Typeorm allow you to create migrations inside of the CLI. In Typeorm, you can run npx typeorm migration create, and then you can pass in the name. And for Prisma, you can run npx prisma migrate dev to create a dev migration. And then in development, you should run npx prisma migrate deploy in your CI or CD pipeline. In summary, I highly recommend both Typeorm and Prisma. But in specific categories, the documentation of Prisma far exceeds the documentation of Typeorm. And both of these ORMs have a CLI that will work for most use cases. However, Prisma looks more promising as they are developing more tools such as the Prisma Studio and their data platform HostDB, and it looks like a lot more development time has been spent on Prisma's tooling versus Typeorm's. The way each ORM lays out its schema is a point of preference. If you like class-based schemas, then go with Typeorm, and if you like the schema file, then you'd go with Prisma. One benefit of Typeorm's schema ability is because it's a class, you can add other decorators to your objects as well, such as the exclude decorator. So say you had a password field inside of a user class. You could add that exclude keyword to your password field so that anytime the user is being passed through a REST API, the password is being excluded from it. However, with Prisma, you'd have to manually take out the password every time you're returning your user object into a REST API. So this is one strength of Typeorm. And both these ORMs have similar CRUD operations as well. But Prisma does have one step over Type. This is because as part of the code generation, it generates specific data types such as update inputs, create inputs, and more, whereas in Typeorm, you'd have to create those DTO objects yourself. Hopefully this video helped you decide which ORM to use. And if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, as I'll be posting more videos like this in the future. Also, if you have any specific videos pertaining to Typeorm or Prisma that you would want to be made, comment that down below.